What's going on, gang? My name's CJ. We're back at it again with another NFL player prop video. This time we're going to be taking a look at the Week 2 NFL slate for Sunday, the 1 p.m. and the 4 o'clock games, all included in this video. So I'm going to be highlighting some of the props that stood out to me in my research when I used Derek Carty's The Blitz projection system. So not only are we going to look at that, but we're also going to dig a little bit deeper using props.cash, which is one of my favorite ways to further research all of the player props for your favorite sport. Now, I have to give you a special thank you because last video that I put out, the one for Thursday Night Football, we broke some records. We went well over 1,000 views. We went for 60 or more likes. I mean, you guys just absolutely smashed it. I appreciate the outpouring of support. Let's try to run it back. Let's try to run this video up to 1,000 views again. Let's try to get the likes up to 60 or more. I'm going to set a conservative goal of 35 or more likes. I think we can definitely do it. So make sure you're subscribed, make sure notifications are turned on, and drop a like on this video if it helps you out in any way. These PrizePicks projections and props, they change throughout the day. So what you see in this video may be different by the time you get over to the PrizePicks board, which is why it's imperative for you to have notifications turned on. And if you don't play on PrizePicks yet, it's a great time to do so. You see the little banner at the bottom of this video? Promo code Curry gets you double your money. Your first deposit of up to $100 is matched 100% of the way. You could put in as little as 20, you can put in as much as 100, and they're going to double you up, giving you plenty of money to get you going for the NFL season. Just use promo code Curry at prizepicks.com. I'll leave a link down in the description for that. I will also leave a link down in the description for the Patreon community. In case you didn't know, Patreon's a way for you to support a content creator like me. If you like these videos, if you like what I'm doing here and you want even more content and you want community, we have a community all set up through Discord. It's an online chat program where you can talk strategies, talk your favorite picks with a group of like-minded individuals. I will give you your first month of Patreon for free if you deposit for the first time on PrizePicks using my promo code Curry, just like you see here on the hat. Yeah, use that promo code, sign up for Patreon. I'll make sure you get your first month of Patreon for free. As I mentioned at the top of the video, all of my projections, all of my research for the most part comes through The Blitz by Derek Carty, which is my number one projection model out there. This is the tool that I use to get my research and everything going on the right foot. So it has everything from the best projections in town to injury reports, game level factors, which kind of allows you to game script how a game flow might go. Very, very helpful. GPP stuff for DraftKings and FanDuel, all included in the Blitz. Plus, he does a show video where you can go and check out some of his favorite picks. He actually gets on camera and talks about the Blitz and some of his favorite plays for the NFL week. So definitely check out the Blitz. I'll leave a link down in the description of this video for that as well. Let's move on because we've got props.cash, something new to the video. We're going to be using props.cash to kind of further our research for these props that stood out to me through the Blitz. So let's go ahead and get things started here. The first prop is going to come from the San Francisco 49ers at Philadelphia Eagles game. I'm looking at Miles Sanders under 64.5 rushing yards. I took the under last week against the Atlanta Falcons. He ended up breaking off a couple of pretty long runs, and that put him over his prop last week. But San Francisco, a much tougher defense, and I think Miles Sanders could potentially struggle here. So let's go ahead and head over to props.cash. Real simple here. There's a drop-down box. You could filter players out by position. So we're going to do that. Click running back. It's going to upload today's props. Once those upload, I'm going to go ahead and find Miles Sanders. And you can do that pretty simply by just typing in his name. There's a handy dandy little search function here. So it loads in at 61.5 rushing yards, but he's at 64.5 rushing yards. So there might be a little bit of value. So we can use this slider here to select an alternative prop line for Miles Sanders. And now that we've done that, you can see that he has covered this prop in 8 out of 13 games. It's a 62% hit rate. Then you've got his averages across the top here, last 10, last 5, and you can see what he's done against San Francisco, averaging just 46 rushing yards in his last meeting, which was back on October 4th of last year, almost a total year ago. So in his first game against Atlanta, he did put up 74 rushing yards, so he barely got over the 64.5 where he's at on PrizePicks today. We're going to take the under according to the Blitz, so it gives you a little bit more insight on Miles Sanders and this prop. The next prop that I want to talk about comes from the Buffalo Bills at the Miami Dolphins game, and I'm talking about Josh Allen and his pass completions of 25.5. I've got him going under, so let's head back to props.cash. We'll switch this from running back to quarterback, and when that loads, we can take a look at Josh Allen here. Now, I'm going to take a different route this time. I'm just going to go to the left-hand side, click his name, then I'm going to click completions, and at 25.5, it's already loaded in here for us. You can kind of get an idea that he's covered this prop in 55% of his last 20 games. That's good for 11 out of 20. So this is kind of one of those props that's almost a coin flip, you can say. And another good thing about props.cash is you can change this from grass to turf. You can change it from home split to an away split. Get an idea of how well he performs on the road versus home, and different types of turf and stuff like that. So pretty cool feature with props.cash. The next prop that I want to talk about comes from the Denver Broncos at the Jacksonville Jaguars, and that's Trevor Lawrence at 12.5 rushing yards. His rushing yards looked a little bit too low. He's still at 12.5 right now. We don't have a real big sample size. In fact, we only have 1 week of Trevor Lawrence in the NFL, so I'm not going to get too in depth on this one, but the over is looking like the lean for me. The one that we can dig in a little bit deeper on is Teddy Bridgewater at 12.5 rushing yards. So let's head back over to props.cash. Quarterbacks are already loaded here. We click Teddy B's name, and then we click the RYDS, which stands for rushing yards, in case you were unfamiliar. Now this line is at 14.5. We're going to have to slide it down to 12.5. That's where he is at on PrizePicks, and you can see at 12.5, he has hit this 56% of the time in his last 16 games. That's good for 9 out of 16 in terms of his cover rate. And then you get his averages here. Last 10, 17.7 rushing yards per game. And his last 5, 18 rushing yards per game. And in his last game against the New York Giants, which was week 1 of this season, 19 rushing yards, covering the 12.5 rushing yard prop. Actually, he's at 11.5. No, he's at 12.5. I think he might have been at 11.5 before. But anyway, he's at 12.5. The over still looking like a good way to go on Teddy Bridgewater, nonetheless. Which brings us to the next game, the Houston Texans at the Cleveland Browns. Mark Ingram at 37.5 rushing yards looked pretty good to me. I know he is sharing. Oh my God, look at this picture of Kareem Hunt. I think that's a very zoomed in picture of Kareem Hunt's chin. I'm hoping that's Kareem Hunt's chin. Anyway, we're talking Mark Ingram at 37.5 rushing yards. The backfield's crowded. David Johnson's back there. Phillip Lindsay's back there. But Mark Ingram kind of led the way for the Houston Texans. Let's hope maybe there's more of the same for him this week. I've got him going over 37.5. So let's hit the drop down. We'll go over to the running back position. Once that loads, we'll use the little search function up at the top here. I'll type in Ingram's name. Now he comes loaded in at 38.5. We're going to slide this down to 37.5. That's where he's at on PrizePicks. You can see he rushed for 85 yards against Jacksonville last week. Jacksonville, not a very good defense. Cleveland, a little tougher, but not great, not out of this world or anything. And then we go back to January 3rd, and he had 39 rushing yards. Other than that, it's been pretty ugly, but this was all last year, so you kind of have to throw that out the window. But then you get his averages across the top here. His average just 14.5 rushing yards against Cleveland, 30.8 in his last 5, and 30 in his last 10 has Mark Ingram. So that one might be a little bit dicey, but I'm going to trust in the blitz and those projections by Derek Carty and probably stick to leaning toward the over on Mark Ingram. But definitely do more research. Definitely do more research. This is not the end-all be-all. You must do your research. So Mark Ingram out of the way at 37.5. We're going to look at Kareem Hunt. And not Kareem Hunt's chin, but his receiving yards looked pretty enticing earlier. Now, I know they've been bumped up. There's that chin once again. It just will not go away. He was at 14.5 earlier. He is now at 16.5 receiving yards. I'm still liking the over versus Houston. So while we've got the running backs already loaded up here, let's go ahead and type in Hunt's name. And we'll click. And then we'll change this to receiving yards. And you can see that in his last 19 games, he has hit this 9 out of 19, good for 47%. Now, this is actually at 15.5. If we slide it up to 16.5, still holding strong at 47%. So more often than not, he's actually going under than he is going over on this prop. But his averages look pretty healthy, especially against Houston. 28 receiving yards per game, 17.6 in his last 5. And if we go back to his last 10, 20.6 receiving yards per game. So I'm liking the over on Kareem Hunt and his big chin and his receiving yards at 16.5. All right, so on to the next game we go, and that's going to bring us to New Orleans Saints versus the Carolina Panthers. The first one that I wanted to look at is DJ Moore at 61.5 receiving yards, our first wide receiver of the day. So let's switch things up. We're going to change positions. Not like that. Not those types of positions. I'm talking like going from running back to wide receiver. So now that we're at wide receiver, we can type in Moore's name. And up comes the prop, and he's at 61.5, which is right where he needs to be. That's where he's at on PrizePicks. And you could see that in his last game, he had 80 yards receiving against the New York Jets. And if we look at the last 16, 10 out of 16 for a 63% hit rate. That's looking pretty darn good if you ask me. And then across the board here, you get an idea of his averages. Averages about 97 yards receiving against New Orleans, 82 receiving yards in his last 5, and 79.9, almost 80 receiving yards in his last 10. Making DJ Moore at 61.5 look pretty darn good to me. So with that one out of the way, let's look at the New Orleans Saints side of things. I've got Mr. Adam Troutman going over 25.5 receiving yards. Let's go take a look and see if we can find him here on props.cash. Troutman, not a name, not a household name that we know at all, but with the New Orleans Saints receiving core pretty depleted, somebody's going to have to step up and catch the football from Jameis. Now, everything that I've looked at seems to suggest that Jameis is going to throw a lot more than he did last week. Winston didn't attempt a whole lot of passes, but he did get a whole lot of touchdowns. This is looking like the type of game where he might have to throw a little bit more than he did against Green Bay. But anyway, you can see Troutman ended up with 18 receiving yards against Green Bay last week. That would have put him under. In fact, his last 18 games, he's only covered twice out of 18, but with injury comes opportunity, and that is exactly what Troutman will get, is more opportunity with Jared Cook out of the picture, Michael Thomas injured, Emmanuel Sanders no longer on the team. Things are going to open up for somebody, and maybe Troutman steps into a bigger role. So with that one in the books, let's move on to the next game. We've got the Cincinnati Bengals versus the Chicago Bears. And the first prop that caught my eye was Joe Burrow and his passing yards. They seemed a bit high, a bit rich for my liking. I think 267.5 was a bit too much. So let's go take a look at props.cash. I'm looking to take the under on Joe Burrow. We'll switch this over from wide receiver tight end to quarterback and then type in Joe Burrow's name. Now you could probably get away with just typing in Joe, and I can, and it's a lot quicker to type in Joe than it is Burrow. And his line's already set up for us at 67.5, matching what it is on PrizePicks. And in his last few games, you can see he has failed to go over 267.5 passing yards in his last 4 straight. His last game, which was against Minnesota in week 1, 261 yards passing, came pretty close, but that was an overtime game where it took extra time to get him up to 261 passing yards. I think they're kind of easing him along. Obviously, he didn't really play in the preseason. Went out last season with a gruesome knee injury. I think they're easing him back in and really leaning on Joe Mixon. Hopefully they do more of the same here, as we are looking to take the under on his 267.5 passing yards. So with that one out of the way, let's look at one from the other side of this game, and I'm talking about David Montgomery, who is at 63.5 rushing yards. So let's head back up to the top of the board and find David Montgomery. 63.5 just seems a little underweight for David Montgomery, especially against the Cincinnati defense, who didn't really get a whole lot better in the offseason. I think this is one where we could look at targeting the over on David Montgomery. So let's change this from quarterback to running back. It'll upload today's running back props, and then we can go ahead and do a search here for David Montgomery. Let's change this line from 64.5 down to 63.5 so that we have an apples to apples with PrizePicks here. And you can see that in his last 17, he has hit 10 out of 17, 59% cover rate. That is a fantastic number. Looking at his averages, no previous averages versus Cincinnati, but almost 90 yards per game in his last 5 and over 85 yards per game in his last 10, making 63.5 against a weak defense look extra juicy to me. And with that one out of the way, that can carry us over to the next game, which is the Los Angeles Rams against the Indianapolis Colts. And I'm going back to the running backs in this game, starting things off with Jonathan Taylor and his 60.5 rushing yards against the Rams. This number here looked a little bit too low. This is a situation where I'm looking to take the over on Jonathan Taylor. So let's head back over to props.cash. Running backs are already loaded up for us. All we need to do from here is simply type in Jonathan Taylor's name. Now we're going to have to slide this line up because he's at 58.5. We got to move him up to 60.5. And you can notice that the graph changes a little bit. It makes things a little bit harder, a little bit of a lower hit rate for Jonathan Taylor in this case when we move that up to 60.5. But fear not, as in his last handful of games, if you throw away the last one, which was against Seattle, he has absolutely smashed 60.5 rushing yards. So I think there's a good chance here for him to go over 60.5. Carson Wentz didn't really play that great. So if the Colts had a choice, I think they would prefer to lean on their run game. And hopefully they get back to doing that with Jonathan Taylor. And they're not playing from behind. If they can play from ahead with a lead, then they could feed their running back, Jonathan Taylor. So I'm looking to take the over on this 60.5 rushing yard prop. Now, the next prop that I'm looking at, I mentioned before, we're targeting the running backs, is going to be Daryl Henderson, who's at 12.5 receiving yards. His rushing yards looked pretty good to me, but in this case, I'm looking to go with his receiving yards. So let's take a look at that. Scrolling back on up here to the top of the PrizePicks board, click receiving yards, scroll back down past Kareem Hunt's big old chin. And there's Daryl Henderson at 12.5 receiving yards. Now, obviously, the dynamic in this Los Angeles Rams backfield has changed from last year to this year. Last year, we had Cam Akers, we had Malcolm Brown, and we had Daryl Henderson all vying for the number one running back duties. But in this case, Malcolm Brown's gone. Cam Akers is out for the season, so that leaves Daryl Henderson and the newly acquired Sony Michel. So Daryl Henderson's going to be more involved in the pass game than he probably ever has been at any point in his career. So we've already got running backs loaded up here on props.cash. All we do now, start typing in Daryl Henderson's name. Then we'll go over to the receiving yards, make sure it's set to 12.5 like it is on PrizePicks. And you can see that in his last game, which was against the Chicago Bears, he ended up with 17 receiving yards, putting him well over 12.5, no problemo. Now last year, receiving numbers weren't as good. So overall, 6 out of his last 16 covering this prop, just 38%, and his averages are all in the red, meaning he's went under this 12.5 receiving yards prop in a majority of his games. But as I said, different dynamic, more workload here for Daryl Henderson. I think this is one where he can catch a couple of balls and go over 12.5, going for 13 or more. So I'm liking that prop. Now let's move to the next game, which is the Las Vegas Raiders, who are coming off a fantastic, wild finish the other night. That was a very fun game. If you missed it, go try and find a replay of that Raiders game. That one was absolutely bonkers. Very fun game to watch. Anyway, they're playing Pittsburgh this week. The only prop that really stood out to me from this game was Chase Claypool and his receiving yards. He was at 47.5. Let's see if he still is. He is still at 47.5. PrizePicks has not moved this one up yet, which is good news for us. So let's go take a look at Chase Claypool. Easy for me to say. We'll switch things over to the wide receiver tight end position. Once this loads up on props.cash, then the easy part begins, and that's just simply typing in Claypool's name. 45.5. We got to bump this up just a little bit to 47.5. Now at 47.5 yards, he has hit 11 out of 18, good for 61% in covering this 47.5 receiving yard prop. Now across the board here, you could see that his averages 62.6 yards per game in his last 5, 53.3 yards per game in his last 10, and 54.1 overall. Now he managed just 45 receiving yards against a very tough Buffalo Bills defense, but the Las Vegas Raiders are not anything close to where the Buffalo Bills are in terms of a defensive unit. So I think this is a situation where Chase Claypool can absolutely eat, and I am liking the over, as does the blitz. So let's move on to the next game. We've got the New England Patriots against the New York Jets. Didn't really love a whole lot from this one. Only got one prop that really kind of stood out to me, and we're going to have to go back up to rushing yards and then back all the way down the board to Tevin Coleman, who's at 30.5 rushing yards. I like the over on Tevin Coleman here. Some people were thinking that Michael Carter was going to be more involved, and he had a little bit of a role, but it was definitely Tevin Coleman's backfield in week 1, and I think it's going to be Tevin Coleman's backfield for the time being until someone like Carter steps up and shows that they're ready to take the reins. So let's type in Tevin Coleman's name. Oh, let's switch this over to running back first. That's a very important thing, that you're on the right position. So you gotta click on running back first, and then you could start typing in Tevin Coleman's name. Now he's already at 30.5. Now you're going to see blood red here. It's going to look awful, but most of these games you got to remember is when he was with the San Francisco 49ers. They had a myriad of running backs plus a myriad of injuries on that team. Completely different dynamic, different situation. He's on the New York Jets now, no longer a member of the San Francisco 49ers. So you can see in week 1 against Carolina, 24 rushing yards, did not meet 31 or more rushing yards. So this one might be one to fade. Even though the blitz likes him to go over 30.5 rushing yards, I can understand why you might want to fade this based on the red, the sea of crimson red that you're seeing on props.cash. So definitely could fade that one. If you do fade that one, then look at Zack Wilson, who was at 1.5 interceptions. I think that's too high. I think he can stay under 2 interceptions. So that could be another alternative if you don't like Tevin Coleman. On to the next game we go. We're going down to the NFC South. The Atlanta Falcons, who just took a beating by my Philadelphia Eagles and Jalen Hurts, are going down to Tampa to take on the champs, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who had a very exciting game. I went to that game against the Dallas Cowboys. What a fun game. What a great way to kick off this NFL season. Just had to throw that in there. Anyway, with this particular game, I'm looking at rushing yards, and I think Leonard Fournette at 35.5 presents some value here against a pretty soft Atlanta Falcons run defense, especially if the Bucs can build a lead and they can turn things over to their running backs, Leonard Fournette, Ronald Jones. Now, key note here, Ronald Jones was benched in that game against the Dallas Cowboys after fumbling the football, but Bruce Arians has said that Ronald Jones will be the starting running back for week 2. So, what that means for Leonard Fournette and how the workload is split up is, to be determined, remains to be seen. But for now, I think Fournette over 35.5 rushing yards looks pretty good. So I've typed in Leonard Fournette's name here onto props.cash. Now he's at 34.5 rushing yards. We're going to have to slide him up to 35.5. But as you can see in his last 18 games, he's got an 8 out of 18 hit rate, which is 44%. Although his last 5 games look pretty good, overall, that 18-game sample size does not look good. 44% is not what we want to see when we're looking to take the over here. You can see his average against Atlanta, 31 rushing yards per game against the Falcons. So we just got to hope that this game is one where the Buccaneers are playing with a lead. And like I said, they could turn around and hand it off to their tailbacks. Because if they can, then I believe that Fournette will have enough opportunities against a soft Atlanta Falcons defense to go over this prop. So with that one out of the way, let's take a look at the Atlanta Falcons side of things. And I'm going to look at Mike Davis at 35.5 rushing yards. I've got him going over this number. 35.5 is just not a lot when you're looking at a running back like Mike Davis, who pretty much has the keys to the kingdom in the backfield for Atlanta. You got Wayne Gallman back there. Ito Smith? Are we really worried about those guys? I think Mike Davis does lead this backfield and will continue to until they sign somebody or somebody gets hurt. So we're going to slide things down to 35.5 rushing yards for Mike Davis. And you can see that he has hit this 63% of the time, good for 10 out of 16. His last game, which was against a tough run defense in the Philadelphia Eagles, he did manage 49 rushing yards. So I think 36 rushing yards here is well within reach. One thing to point out, you can see this little red square. That's 16.5 rushing yards per game against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Not a very good rushing yard average. So if you want to fade Mike Davis or take the under, I completely understand. Which takes us over to the next game. And for that game, we're going to the west side, Minnesota at Arizona. The first one that stuck out to me was Dalvin Cook at 80.5 rushing yards. At 80.5 rushing yards, it seems awfully low for a stud running back who pretty much is the workhorse not pretty much. I mean, he is the workhorse for the Minnesota Vikings, 80.5 rushing yards. I think the over makes a lot of sense. So let's go ahead and type in Dalvin Cook's name. And he pops up at 82.5 rushing yards. So we're going to take the slider, move it down a little bit to 80.5. And you can see that at 80.5, he has hit 9 out of his last 15 games. Good for a 60% conversion rate or hit rate, however you want to phrase it. Now in his last 2 games, he has went well under 80.5 with 73 yards against New Orleans, last game of the season. But the first game of this season, he went for 61 against Cincinnati. Not what you want to see out of your stud running back, Dalvin Cook. But his averages are very strong, 97.6 yards per game in his last 5, 112.9 yards per game in his last 10, and almost 8 yards per game overall. So Dalvin Cook looking pretty darn good for an over here. The big question mark is going to be, can the Minnesota Vikings defense hold up? If they're playing from behind, if the Minnesota offense is playing from behind, Dalvin Cook's not going to get enough touches to go over 80.5 yards unless he breaks a big one. So Minnesota's going to have to keep the Arizona Cardinals offense in check and try to keep this game close and competitive for Dalvin Cook to get enough work to get the over on 80.5 rushing yards. So with that one out of the way, let's move to the next game, the Dallas Cowboys at the Los Angeles Chargers. I've got the first prop being that of Dak Prescott at 10.5 rushing yards. This seems too low. I took his rushing yards over against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and he ended up coming through clutch for me using his feet. Of course, he injured his ankle last year, and it kind of ended his season prematurely. But everything seems to be fine and dandy. He's moving around well. So let's take a look at props.cash here at Dak Prescott and this rushing yards prop. Switch things over to quarterback. Then we'll just go ahead and type in Dak. You can search using his first name or his last name, which is very handy and convenient. Click rushing yards. And let's move the line from 12.5, where it currently sits, down to 10.5, where it is on PrizePicks. Boom. Dialed it in. And you can see that in his last 6 games, he has hit this prop 5 out of 6 times. He's a pretty mobile, pretty good scrambler, good with his feet. And he has hit 83% of the time, so you can't really argue against that. His last 5, his rushing average, 15.2 yards per game and 17.7 yards per game overall. Had 13 rushing yards against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in week 1, even better. So I am liking the over. And I agree with the blitz in this one that this is achievable for Dak Prescott. Which brings us to the final game of the video, the Tennessee Titans against the Seattle Seahawks. And for that, we are looking at some rushing yards and receiving yards. Let's start with the rushing yards. And we're talking Derrick Henry here against this Seattle defense. They kind of kept the Colts in check. They faced Jonathan Taylor in the Indianapolis Colts last week. The Seattle defense looked a bit better. But Derrick Henry's a whole different animal. He's a whole different monster than Jonathan Taylor. And, if Derrick Henry and the Tennessee Titans can kind of keep this game close, kind of the same situation Dalvin Cook is in, if they don't let Seattle get out to a big lead and they can keep running the football, then Derrick Henry should have no problem getting 85 or more rushing yards. So let's go take a look while we have things up here on props.cash. We'll switch it on over to running backs, because we'll be talking about the Seattle running back, Chris Carson, right after this one. So we'll type in Henry's name. Now he's at 86.5, but 84.5 over on PrizePicks. So a little bit of value there on PrizePicks. We'll move this down to 84.5, if I can get it dialed in here. And at 84.5, you could see that in his last 18, he's hit 11 out of 18, good for 61%. As I mentioned, this dude is a freak. He's a monster. He can go for 200 yards, 250 yards, 215 yards, 212 yards. We know what he's capable of. His last 2 games have not been good, but the one against Arizona in week 1, Arizona just came out on fire. They couldn't be stopped. They wouldn't stop scoring touchdowns. Kyler Murray was ridiculous. So, when you allow that many points to the opposing team, your star running back's not going to be very involved. So that's kind of the case. He got game scripted out. But his averages 118.6, 128.2 in his last 10, and then 118.1 overall speak for themselves. Derrick Henry is a beast. Let's finish things off here with Chris Carson. His rushing yards looked pretty juicy, but we're going to go to his receiving yards. I think those looked even better. Chris Carson, heavily involved in the passing attack here for the Seattle Seahawks. 16.5 receiving yards presented some value in my opinion. He is still at 16.5, and let's go take a look and see how well he's done with this number in the past. We type in his name, we click, we change this to receiving yards, and make sure that the line is at 16.5 as it is on PrizePicks. And you can see 64%. That's pretty darn good in terms of his hit rate on this prop. 9 out of 14. So his last game, which was against a tough Colts defense, 26 receiving yards. He went well over this prop. Struggled toward the end of last season, only hitting 1 out of his last 4 to cap the season off. But overall, his averages are pretty strong. 17.2 in his last 5, 20.5 in his last 10, and 22.7 overall. So I am liking the over on Chris Carson and his 16.5 receiving yards. But what do you guys think? Are there any props in this video that are standing out to you? Maybe there's one I didn't talk about. Drop a comment down in the comment section below. Maybe you can help me out. Maybe you can help somebody else out. If you don't play on PrizePicks, promo code Curry, double your money up to $100, giving you $200 to play with. Go to prizepicks.com, check it out now. Links down in the description to everything you need. Good luck in week 2. Let's make some more cash over on PrizePicks. Peace out.